South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. That's according to a report by the World Bank that ranks the Republic first among 164 countries surveyed. According to the report titled Inequality in Southern Africa, an assessment of the Southern African Customs Union, or SACU, the legacy of colonialism and apartheid rooted in racial and spatial segregation continues to reinforce inequality almost 30 years into democracy. So we take a closer look at the building blocks of the country and hone in on apartheid spatial planning and its effects on present-day South Africa. And to help us do just that, we're joined by senior lecturer at the Wits School of Architecture, Dr. Sechaba Maape, and narrative development manager at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Kneo, Mokgopa. Thank you very much to both our guests and thank you for your time this morning. So Kneo, let's start with you. How should we understand spatial inequalities in present-day South Africa, informed by the past?
I think there's a couple of ways of understanding it. I think on the first, it's the macro. So in the sense that the apartheid government had an obsession with delineation, with categories, with structural, hierarchies and things like that. And in the macro sense, you see a country, and it's been on many covers of magazines like Time magazine, where you have suburbs neatly put out on one side, beautiful trees, jacarandas, large plots, and otherwise livability, really. And on the other side of a boundary wall, you see oftentimes an informal settlement with many, people living in a very concentrated space. That's the macro of it. But at the same time, we also need to understand it as a life that we live. It's very intimate. It bleeds into your sense of self, the way and where you grew up and what that environment was signifying. Builds into your sense of identity. I'm thinking about, for instance, environmental racism, where oftentimes, even in this country, landfills, dumps, incineration sites, and otherwise power plants are disproportionately placed around areas where black people live, making the space and the environment where you live the place where you put things you don't want. And that feeds into you. And so it's twofold. On the one hand, it's the macro structures of it all, of, I'm going to say zoning in that kind of way and what kinds of families can live where, but it's also very intimate.
We'll get into the intimacy in a few moments. Dr. Maape, you sit in the halls at Wits University where some of the architects of spatial planning once occupied. And so what is it that you have unearthed about spatial planning, in particular in South Africa's townships?
Well, I think the most important thing that I've learned is that it was designed. And so there were a couple of men, especially, who worked at Wits University and other universities in South Africa, whose idea was to design specific kinds of spaces for black people. And so they went through a very creative process, in actual fact, to design these spaces. As we discussed in the last time we met, one of these men, Professor Calderwood, who later went to take the apartheid township model to the CSIR for it to proliferate across South Africa, tested these models in his yard. And as I told you the last time, one of the things that was introduced was the peach tree that even my co-host here says he was, very disappointed it was so engineered, was introduced. And so the thing that I uncovered was that these things were very, very much planned. And in fact, the model of the apartheid township, which was modeled under something called modernity or modernism, came from Europe. And their idea back then, also very specific white men during the early 20th century, was to create a kind of architecture that was devoid and disconnected from tradition and anything that came from, the past, according to them. And their aspirations was to create something that was completely clean and, cut away from any form of heritage, so to speak. And in my view, that was actually another way of saying being disconnected from the earth, being disconnected from being grounded. And that was the beginning of alienation, alienating us from who we are as human beings. I always like to say that we are all indigenous people of planet Earth. And right now, many people don't really understand what that means. What does it mean to be a people that's connected to the earth and connected to the ground? And our townships are a very sinister example of that, where, you know, they're bland. Where's the color? Where are the patterns? Where are the things that connect us to the rhythm of this planet, the rhythm of the cosmos? There's nothing like that. And so that was really some of the very deep and sinister things that came with colonization and then later apartheid and apartheid spatial planning.
Now, you used rather the word intimate. You say it's very intimate for us. What does that mean?
I guess I'm referring to the ways that it's not merely an outside, immaterial, objective thing, but it becomes personal. And in that way, I'm maybe referring to the ways in which the apartheid government had a very strong intention to turn black people into labor, so to understand yourself as labor. Even when you look at the planning of where people live, it's very much to facilitate labor. In fact, many townships and otherwise, and other, I think, homelands, they came to be known as homelands later. Initially, they were referred to as labor reserves. It's the place where black people, labor in this country, were almost corralled into living, I think, about 40 kilometers from places of industry, you know? So there's this way that it's not trying to create a home in the full sense of a word. It doesn't give you opportunities for living and dreaming a hopeful life in that way. It really kind of guides you into understanding yourself as a species of labor. I think Professor Sechaba Maape, he refers to it in a paper as economic animals. We get turned into economic animals, which is to say that all our lives, every moment of it, is about crossing these delineations of space, you know. So, for instance, you think about the mine dumps, the Langlaagte mine dumps that separate Soweto and Katlehong from the city, for instance, you know. And every day growing up, at least, crossing those mine dumps to go to school, very long, an hour-long journey every single day. But there's something about that, right? So I have a name in this side, I have a different name that side. Over here, my name is Carlo. Over there, they call me SK. You know what I mean? Things like that. Over here, this is a strange example, but I eat my food very comfortably with my hands and I'm enjoying it. Over there, I make sure that I swallow before I take something to drink. You know what I'm trying to say? So I'm pointing towards these differences in how we are made to transform ourselves into labor, understand ourselves as economic animals and many other things like that.
The psychology of it, because over there, over here, gilligationing. And so, Dr. Maape, when we speak of living and dreaming a hopeful life or being deprived of that as a result of apartheid spatial planning, you speak of heritage, you speak of being in connection with the earth, you speak of some of the houses that were designed being so mundane. It was 4-room box houses. The colors were all the same.
Yeah.
Why is that psychologically important to place people in box houses, if you will?
Well, like my colleague here is saying, basically people were seen as objects. And so, you know, they are treated like livestock or, you know, fodder or something like that, where really you're just giving them the basics. For them to, you know, use the toilet, which was outside. Sometimes there wasn't any drinking water, or at least plumbing for water. When I grew up, we used to use the tap outside at the toilet. And then the rooms, the spaces were really so small that, you know, sometimes there wasn't even privacy in those kind of houses. And you know, the disconnect was very stark because if you think about where we lived before, pre-colonial cities, let's call them cities, like Bokoni, for example, in Mpumalanga, we've got evidence that these were sprawling African cities. An African homestead has, you know, your parents, your grandparents, sisters, brothers, uncles, all in this space. And it's very rich with all our cultural practices and that kind of thing. And then you take that and you reduce it into the small little 4-room house. And you expect people to make a way of life within these kind of conditions. And so what ultimately they were trying to do was to break our humanity, in essence, break our sense of pride, our sense of self, our sense of dignity, and turn us into objects because capitalism relies on predictability. It relies on something that, you know, you can commodify. So if you see me as a person, you can't really commodify me, but if you see me as an object, you can, see me as a commodity, and I can go and work in the mines or in the factories or whatever the case may be. So forum is actually an architectural manifestation of a commodification of a human being. And, the liberation struggles all over the world are actually struggles to turn us back into being people and back into being humans. So women have gone through that, being treated as objects. Black people have gone through that, being treated as objects. And my argument is that we need to stop treating everything as objects, including land, including nature. So that box is really a symbol of objectification.
Speaking of objectification, I'm curious, like we said, you occupy some of those halls where those men who were the architects of all of this that we're seeing manifesting in present-day South Africa, which is not all that good. What is that like for you? Is it a mind trip?
Actually, I'm very happy to be there. And, on my wall in my office, literally there are photographs of colonial towns in South Africa. And when you walk the halls of the school, there are still colonial buildings and that kind of thing. And I leave them up there because I want to remember the fact that I'm now there. The guys who were planning my grandmother's house, I'm now there, and I'm, prepared, along with other colleagues. I've got a colleague, Mokgopa, who's now pursuing a PhD, and she's looking at turning around the idea of low-cost housing and trying to give it dignity. We've got Tebogo Ramatlo in Pretoria, who's doing his PhD to change around this apartheid spatial planning. Jabu Makubu at UJ, he's looking at urban planning and trying to intensify an African urban planning. So we are there now, and we are, ready to change this thing around. So it's actually pride that I feel being there. Yes, it's depressing when you read that your whole life was kind of engineered. The things that you were made to think are real were not. But it also is important that we're there to turn that whole thing around.
Kneo, you spoke about the tale of two cities in this country and the person that you are literally having to be, where you split your personalities. If you live in the South, when you're driving to work, you're faced by the sun. And if you're living in the South, when you're driving home, you're faced by the sun either way. And apparently that, too, was deliberate and it was engineered. And so when we take a look at how apartheid spatial planning has manifested itself in South Africa, what would you say in terms of the correlation of the kind of people that we are now, right? Like you speak about the dignity or lack of dignity that was deliberate so that people can feel a certain way about themselves. What do we look like as a result today?
I think the language that you used as well was also quite important. What do we look like? Because it does manifest in physical appearance. Living close to the mine dumps, and again, this I've never been able to corroborate as structural design, but the winds, the southwesterly wind, blowing the mine dump and pieces of mine dump, you know what I mean, into the townships. And so you get many cases of bronchial pneumonia, asthma, and other things like that. So people's lungs are not working. But more than that, you get deficiencies in nutrition, in, chubaba, things on your face, things like that. And so there's a very real landing of what all this means. And of course, at the same time, on the other side, it's funny how Johannesburg is considered the world's largest man-made forest. But that man-made forest is only on one side of the mine dumps. And the world that exists there then is it's beautiful, In particular parts of the year, you get the jacaranda trees who kind of turn your life and the environment to this purple dream of human rights and constitutionalism, and you know what I mean? And so what it's created is then, and I don't know a different word to describe what I mean by this, but livability. The real prospects that you can have a life, that you can dream about a future, all of those consequences. I like referring and remarking on what's underneath the mine dumps. So around 2010, researchers at Wits actually were called, it had been raining for quite a while by the Crown mines, and the mine dump was ebbing. the rain was pushing it out. And they found these depressions in the soil, these holes, but they were very uniform, and there was still stuff inside of them. And so Wits came, and with different scanners and modeling and other things like that, and some partial archaeological digs in that way, what they found was that there were human bodies beneath the mine dumps. And it's a state of affairs that we live with today. Yeah. And kind of, what's the word now, contending with it is a very depressing thing, Imagine the psychological sense that my father is beneath the mine dump. And of course, these were black men, which kind of speaks to some of what my colleague was speaking to as well, about the specificity, about who is targeted for what and how and where. But these were men that worked in the mines. They died in the mines. Initially, the area just outside was a burial ground, and they used it as a burial ground, which itself was an injustice because many of them were migrant workers that didn't get proper burial practices. And then after many years, they asked for permission from the state to use that same space as the space for the mine dumps themselves. So we're living in all of these conditions, these terrifying, traumatic, actually, conditions where we look very differently based on the legacies of spatial apartheid. We can only dream particular ways. The air is different. Our thoughts are different. During the work that we do at the foundation, we worked with different partners, and we built a home for someone that used to live in an informal, in a shack. And the reflection after a month, she said that, I didn't realize that my mind was not working. Mm. When you're in that square, hot box constantly, that was what she said. And after now living in a proper home, there's that sense of humanness. Mm. I'm not an economic animal. I'm not a piece of labor. I'm human,
Mm. With those bodies that were found, it makes you question spiritually, because sometimes you walk into certain spaces and it feels eerie. Like, I couldn't think you're right there. In present day South Africa, I'd like for us to take a look, because South Africa is not a country that is devoid of plans. We've got so many plans since the dawn of democracy. I wonder if we can bring this up for our viewers and take a look at some of those plans that we have seen over the years. So you've got the Reconstruction and Development Plan, the RDP plan. You've got the Growth, Employment and Redistribution, the Integrated Sustainable Rural Development Program, the New Growth Program, the National Development Plan, the 9-point plan, but wait, there's more. A 14-point plan, the Growth, Renewal and Sustainability Plan, the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan. And so with all of these plans, some of them talk about creating employment over the next 10 years, turning the tide in terms of the actual living conditions of people, and addressing spatial planning. Dr. Maape, you spoke about the work that some of your colleagues and yourself actually do. Mm-hmm. And so maybe let's assess some of the plans that we've had. And when it comes to spatial planning, how far have we moved the needle in the country?
When I actually started, or how I became interested in architecture is because on Carte Blanche, there was an interview with Kneo, who is an architect here in Johannesburg, and he was talking about a project called Kopano, which was to turn the Joburg CBD into Wakanda, basically. The government owns a lot of buildings in the city, and the idea was to turn these buildings into buildings that reflected us as Africans and our values. And so when I started working in 2008, I went to work at his practice, and we had lots of ideas to turn these buildings into a city that reflected our aspirations. So just imagine an African city that really was an African city, that really, was inspired by our architectural heritage here in Africa. Like I always talk about colors and patterns and the materiality, the kind of spaces, that was the vision. And even today, Kopanong is still trying to go somewhere. And look, I'm not being judgmental because it's actually a very complex process, but the aspirations are there. Whoever came up with that idea clearly had an incredible vision, for us to have at least one city in the whole of Africa that was truly a modern, technologically advanced, yet responded to our aspirations and who we are as African people city. we still don't really have that. And, it's quite disappointing that people like myself and others are there, and we've got the ideas. There is no shortage of ideas, even at the universities. Every year, my students, who I'm doing a shout-out to because they begged me to, we do projects where we come up with different cities and models which are inspired by our heritage in Africa. And they end up, just there in the university because ultimately we are not politicians, And look at what's happening today in Joburg in terms of the political issues and all the other metros. If that's not sorted out, how else are we going to deal with it? But then on the other hand, I have worked with clients. Like, for example, I did a building in my hometown in Kuruman with an incredible client, Mpho Molema, who had this vision to create a kind of place for the community. And we used very inexpensive materials because, we didn't have much of a budget. But that building is off-grid. They don't have issues with load shedding. It's inspired by African ideas, African architecture. The community use it, so it's trying to stitch back the broken family structures in the community. Weddings happen there, all kinds of stuff. Even my wife and I, the most beautiful woman in the world, we had part of our wedding happen there. So there are opportunities, and if we're going to wait for, our elders to sort their issues out, it's never going to happen. So I'm hoping that our patrons and our clients, the Black Coffees of this world and all of the guys who actually have the money and the vision would come, and we could work on that together instead of waiting for, the most ideal circumstances.
We are the ones we've been waiting for.
Oh, exactly.
In fact, I believe we've actually got some of those visuals, and we can show our viewers of this building that you speak of, if we're not mistaken. If we can bring those visuals up, and we can show our viewers as well some of the work that you have done. But in doing that, now you are a narrative development manager. I love that title. I think I've told you before. But I can imagine also what a big, big job that is. Because here you hear it, right? All of these plans that we have, you have students who are currently studying to be architects who want to change the face of not only this country but the continent. And yet, politically, there's shenanigans. And so what is the narrative of South Africa today?
So I think the narrative of South Africa right now is absolutely a polycrisis, which is to say that we have multiple compounding crises that are pushing us in different kinds of directions. And you can name them sometimes off the top of your head, We have the energy crisis and unemployment crisis. We have a crisis in education. We have a crisis with gender-based violence, and it goes on and on. Climate change is also another one that affects us very much on the eastern coast in particular. So that's a real thing, and it seems as though the way that people are responding to these circumstances has not necessarily been to lean into structures of the state, which is to say that political systems are not working for us. Recently we had a dialogue, maybe 2 months ago, called What Does This Moment Call For? And it was Dr. Stimbile Mbete, who said that we don't have a money problem, which fascinated me because, I think the story is about, and the narrative is about Africa and South Africa is that there's no money.
Underdeveloped.
But no, it's not a money problem that we have in many of the issues that we've just named now. We also don't have a technology problem. We have some of the most advanced technology in the world. Recently a family emigrated to Canada. And they found that the banking system was still very much a little bit older from ours. They didn't have some of the tech that we have, So we have decent technology. And she named a whole long list, really, of things that we don't have a problem with. And she said that we have a political problem. So, for instance, even in all the plans that you were mentioning there's a way that South Africans and people in South Africa more broadly, even from the word go, seem to understand this as discourse, as storytelling, but no real intention in a way. And the way that people are responding is to, unfortunately, what we have been doing is reproducing the logic of apartheid, which is to say that, no, I want apartheid in my name. So I want my private gated community where you can't come in unless you have access. I want my private school where the government will not tell my child what to read. I want a private hospital as well. So that, you know what I mean? And listen, necessarily it is often because the state services are not as quality as they could be. But necessarily at the same time, that's what we're doing. We are almost like a micro-apartheid, you know, where social mobility and class mobility and the story of undoing the ills of the past is about reproducing apartheid, you know. It's almost like that allegory, or rather the theatre play, Sizwe Banzi is dead, you know. So Sizwe, and if you haven't seen it, Sizwe Banzi, so a character during apartheid wants to work in a particular place but can't because he doesn't have the right pass. He doesn't have the pass that says you may work in Transvaal or wherever else. And he comes across a dead body and he goes through the body's, you know, pockets and otherwise and finds a passbook. And the pass has exactly the right permissions to work where he wants to work. And so he decides to steal his identity, you know, and work in this new space in a way. And really, it's such a powerful analogy for the conditions that we're in right now, the narrative of where we are right now, where we have to kill yourself or kill identity to gain personhood. You know what I mean? And I think that's where I'd like to maybe take a pause around the narrative.
I'd like for us to take a look at Dloziyakhala, Dr. Maape. Explain that for our viewers, that project.
Okay, so that was a project that was in collaboration with architects, Lemon Pebble Architects, and our client, who unfortunately is late, Gogom Bye, wanted to create a facility where she could produce indigenous medicine. She had been doing this for some time, and she now wanted to, she got the funding from government to actually formalize this building and that kind of thing. And so they called me to be part of the project, and obviously, you know, being someone who really wants to infuse African values and African philosophies into the architecture, I designed a structure that involved indigenous methods of architecture in the way in which the building was conceived. And so, you know, again, it was off-grid. The intention is the building would be off-grid. It would be simple to build. You know, I introduced things like patterns and color. And it was also resilient. So the roof of the building was meant to be made of steel, to have solar panels on top. The floor of the building was robust, but the in-between of the building was made of earth clay, which is the kind of thing that we would have used in the past. But this time it's futuristic, yet it's incorporating our heritage. So what people call Afrofuturism was really the intention behind it. So for me, projects like that are, you know, little mini Wakandas and little mini versions of what we could achieve if, for example, we had more clients, like I said, people out there who are willing to try those things out. And I want to say to South Africans, you know, when you want the square box thing, you know, there are two types of buildings that people typically want, especially houses. Either the Tuscan thing, so the one with the columns on the front of the house and the, you know, red tiles on the roof, which comes from Italy, Tuscany, and it's actually their traditional architecture. So, you know, often people will be like, how, but and I'm like, well, you're doing the rentability to Europe.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the other option that people will have is they call it, modern, which is like the white straight lines. And that's literally somebody who said that, you know, when it was invented, someone was like, me, the architecture I want to create must be disconnected from everything. And so you aspire to things that people created either through whatever strange philosophies, which they called modernity, or through their own heritage in Europe. And we aspire to those things, and we think those things are so great. And they, in Europe, by the way, are incredibly strict when it comes to their heritage. I mean, you can't even sneeze the wrong way on a building there without getting fined, you know. Yet our own heritage and our own culture, we're not really proud to incorporate that in a obviously contemporary way and in a way that responds to whatever context we're in today. climate change, sustainability, including, whatever technology we want to incorporate. I believe that's part of the suffering that has come from living in the townships and the incredible way in which we were made to hate ourselves and to hate whatever it is that is coming from us. And we need to liberate ourselves, like Steve Biko and Solomon Plaatje were trying to help us liberate ourselves. So that's really the intention behind projects like that and all the work that I'm doing. I want us to be proud to be Africans, to be proud to be black. I am black. I might not look like that. To be proud to be black and to and to really, in a physical, spatial, aesthetic way, manifest a truly South African and African liberated, cities and spaces for us to live in.
Each one teach one. And in closing up the conversation, Kneo, what is the narrative of South Africa in the next 10 years, right? So it's not just about impact work, but it's legacy work, because there are those who are going to be coming after us. Today there's a conversation about Marabo Mandela Vayentseng, bona re phela byang. So tomorrow is going to be a conversation Marabo Neo Vayentseng, bona re phela byang. So what is this South Africa that we're building for tomorrow?
I think at the very bottom of it is almost a renewal of the notion that the people have power. It's very much similar to, I think his name is, what is it, from the Black Panthers, power everywhere there's people. There's a way in which over the advent of democracy, we've been outsourcing power and even villainizing power, right? So which is to say that we understand power as immediately and necessarily violent. It must be extractive, it must be abusive even, you know what I mean? So stand up to power. But what about our power? The whole project of the movement and the resistance against apartheid was about people's power. It was the UDM, I think UDF's slogan as well, people's power. And so when democracy came, we said, okay, cool, the Constitution will have the power, Mandela will have the power, we don't have to anymore. And so if we're going to get out of the poly-crisis that we're in at the moment, we're going to have to reconstitute the idea that the people have power, and it's about people's power.
And in closing up the conversation, Dr. Maape, in some of your research, you speak about this notion of the snake. If you can explain that to our viewers in relation to the earth and just going out of the conversation.
Okay, well, that's actually me introducing African philosophy into architecture, and we teach this at Wits even now. The snake really just represents life. It represents us having a non-antagonistic relationship with life. And so our, ancestors, the people who came before us, knew that you have to symbolize life in some sort of way so that people can interact with it. In other African cultures, it's African masks. Typically when a young boy goes into initiation, a man with an African mask comes and grabs him. Just like how sometimes life can grab you and takes him to go through this initiation and eventually takes the mask and puts it on this young man, meaning that you are now ready to live and to be deeply connected to life. And for me, rhythm, music, color, pattern, all of those things are the language, the aesthetic language of life. And that's really, I believe, who we are as Africans. And so the snake works in the same way. And this is something that we can offer to people. They alienated themselves, wherever alienation comes from, with a box and the white building that's floating. It came to South Africa, we were alienated with the same tools and alienated from being part of this world, being part of this life. And so for me, that snake and all of these other African artistic and architectural tools are our way of reconnecting to life, reconnecting to the rhythm, to amapiano, to drum, to all of the things that really make us feel like we're alive.
A big thank you to both our guests for your time this morning and for honoring our invitation. Dr. Sechaba Maape, Senior Lecturer at the School of Architecture and Planning, and Mokgopa, Narrative Development Manager at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Thank you.